Welcome back to the Odyssey Academy. We are moving on to lesson 11, which is practice, practice, and practice. By now, hopefully you've developed your long-term problem solution. Maybe you've edited it, you've practiced spontaneous, you've integrated your style into the long-term solution. All of those things are great. Maybe you're still working on some of those things, but the idea is at some point, you're gonna get to a level of completion where the only thing left to do is practice your solution time and time again before you actually present it in front of judges and an audience in competition. So today for our agenda, what we're going to do is talk just a bit about how to practice your solution, talking about what stage presence is, how to maximize the 8 minutes performance time that you have, the idea of choreographing every movement, even those that are happening backstage out of sight from the judges and the audience, the notion of pacing versus speed running through a scene, your millionth time the audience is first, this concept of it's the first time they've seen it and the millionth time you performed your solution. And then finally, getting feedback from reactions. As we said, we can't ask for feedback from friends, family, parents. We can't do that, but we can perform our solution in front of them and just judging how they respond to our performance, get a little bit of insight about what went well and maybe what didn't, or maybe what's confusing. So let's go ahead and get started with this idea of what is stage presence. So part of the Odyssey of the Mind program is teaching students how to present their ideas, how to perform their ideas. And part of that includes this notion of stage presence. I will tell you time and time again, a lot of times you watch teams that sort of mumble through their lines and nobody's quite sure, they haven't quite memorized what they're supposed to say. And that's not a very compelling stage presence, right? If you went to a Broadway show and people were stumbling over their lines or like didn't quite know how to move on stage as they're acting, that would not be a show you wish you paid money for, right? So let's go through each of these components one at a time to kind of get a strong understanding of what stage presence actually is and why it matters. So number one, a polished, well put together presentation is just going to be more enjoyed by judges in the audience, right? It looks more professional. You can tell that the team members have spent time practicing and working on their solution, which is what you want to see, right? That looks a lot more polished and better than a performance that doesn't have that same level of sophistication. The other thing is you want memorized lines that are delivered, not spoken. So let's explain what that is. It's not enough just to memorize your lines and to repeat them back while you're walking around on stage, right? You have to memorize your lines, but perform them with emotion, right? Just like I did there. Because if you just perform them with emotion, blah, 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 you just say through your lines like this, nobody cares, nobody understands. There's no feeling there, right? If you're gonna act, if you're gonna perform, then do it, act, perform, get into your character. That's gonna make a more compelling presentation and it's gonna give you greater stage presence for your solution. You also want to have unique characters and words in action. In a previous lesson, I told you that with 17 members performing, if you have 17 members on stage and you all act and perform the same way in the same character, we really just have one character on stage just in 7 different people, right? So if you're going to have people in a scene, you want to have different, unique, rich characters, right? That's what makes something interesting. If you've ever seen the movie Clue before, each of those characters, Mrs. White, Miss Scarlet, they all have unique personalities, right? And that's what we're looking for because that's going to create compelling individual characters that we want to get to know, that we want to learn more about, that can convey emotion and comedy and drama in a way that having the same character just doesn't cut it, right? So keep that in mind as you're doing your performing as well. Also, you want to have good enunciation and projection, right? So when I'm speaking to you, I'm speaking very clearly on these videos because I want you to be able to understand what I'm saying. The same thing is true if we're performing in front of an audience. Sometimes your solution is going to be given in a gymnasium because you need the space for the vehicles or the technical items that you're building. So you have to make sure that you're very clear in your language and how you articulate different words and also project, right? Make sure you're speaking loudly enough that people in the back of the room can hear what you're saying. What you don't want to do, and what sometimes first-time teams do, is they talk like this and they mumble the words, they put their hands in front of their face, you can't really understand what they're saying. No, you want to be very clear. You want to make sure that in those 8 minutes, you're communicating everything you need to communicate as clearly as possible so that everybody in the room understands what you're saying and why you're saying it. The other thing you want to do is what we call cheating out to the audience in the theater world. So a lot of times in real life when we're talking to somebody, if you're the audience, I'm talking to somebody over here, I'm facing them, I'm talking to them. In theater, we call this cheating out. We're kind of facing the audience. I'm still talking to this person. They're talking to me, but they're also kind of cheating out the other direction, facing the audience. Because again, we're not having private conversations in the real world, we're performing a stage production. So we are delivering what we're saying, yes, to the other character in the scene, but also to the audience and to the judges. So we want to make sure that we include this notion of cheating out to the audience in our performance when we're performing. There are times even when I've seen performers, this is true in theater, put their entire back to the audience. It's a no-no, right? We never want to turn our back to the audience unless it's part of some choreographed move, because once we don't face the audience any longer, they can't hear us as well because the noise, the sound is traveling the other direction, right? So just be aware of cheating out and making sure we're projecting and articulating to the audience so that they can feel a part of the conversation and they can hear us very clearly. The other thing is having confidence in your movement and mannerisms, right? So you want to have deliberate movements, right? Using my hands here. You want to make sure that when you are acting in a certain character or role, that what you do with your body language, what you do with your body is consistent and meaningful to your character and what's happening in the scene, right? You don't want to kind of like slump on stage and like, just kind of like, kind of like low motions, whatever. Because if you don't have that confidence as you're presenting, if you're not making like important moves depending on what your character is and what your purpose is in that scene, then it's kind of unclear, right? If you're supposed to be fighting and being very strong, you're just kind of like, hey, like whatever. And then suddenly like nobody really knows if you're fighting or if you're like toy fighting, whatever, right? So the idea is when you're acting on stage, in addition to speaking clearly, you also have to have clear movements, clear body language as well, to clearly communicate what your character, who your character is and what they're trying to do, right? And the last part here is if everybody does that, if all the characters in your play, all your team members in your skit, make it clear that they articulate, they know what they're doing, their movements are bold and deliberate and consistent. If everyone does that, you're going to have an amazing stage presence, right? Because all of you are bringing these compelling characters to life on stage with deliberate actions and words. The audience and the judges will be completely enraptured by whatever it is you're presenting, all right? So keep that in mind as you're presenting your solution and practicing your solution. Next thing I want to talk about is maximizing the 8 minutes, right? So what does it mean to maximize 8 minutes? Well, again, you only have 8 minutes to present your solution to the judges and to the audience. You want to make it count, right? You have to convey all those elements, all the limitations, all the requirements of the solution in just 8 minutes. Now, when we talked about scoring, we talked about this idea that your points are not allocated evenly, right? Some of the elements that are required get more points, and some of the elements that are required get fewer points. There are some things that you'll do that don't get any points, right? So when it comes time to maximizing your 8 minutes, it's very smart to use our rubric evaluation technique and say, well, if this part of our skit gets the most points, we really want to highlight this and spend the most time on this, right? Same thing is true for the technical problems, right? If our vehicle gets the most points and we get scored on the integration or creativity of that vehicle, then we should probably spend more time, even in our solution, on this particular element, right? So just make sure you're looking at that allocation of time and the allocation of points and how those things fit together. Now, don't forget, the time will start at, whenever it starts, they say begin, and the teams are expected to begin their solution right when time begins, right? So as soon as the timekeeper says time begins, you and your team have 8 minutes from that point to present your solution. At the end of 8 minutes, you should be done, or you'll get stopped in problems 1, 2, and 4, or you'll get penalized if you go over in problems 3 and 5. So the reason that I mention this is that a lot of times you'll see OM teams start, and for the first minute or even 2 minutes sometimes, all they're doing is setting up stuff, right? They're putting the backdrop together, they're moving costumes, they're putting props out for a minute or up to 2 minutes. And I will tell you, that is not good use of time. Not only is it boring for the audience and the judges, but now instead of having 8 full minutes to present your solution, you only have 6 or 7 minutes to actually get everything communicated that you need to communicate, which is even less time than the 8 minutes, which already isn't a ton of time, right? So what you'll find is that the very polished teams, the teams that have done OM for a while, as soon as that timekeeper says begin, their presentation starts, their performance starts, their lines start, their acting starts, right? They can be setting up and acting at the same time, or maybe they don't have anything to set up because they don't have many props or backdrops. So just be aware to the 8 minutes that you have it's not a lot of time. So you want to make sure you maximize those 8 minutes. And if you're spending a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes just setting up to get started, that is not maximizing your 8 minutes. So think that through in terms of your specific solution and whether or not you're actually adhering to that sort of strategy. It's a useful tool for you to have also in your toolkit. So related to this idea of a good stage presence is choreographing every movement that you make. if you've done theater before, you know that the people backstage, the tech people, are just as important as the actors and actresses, because they're the ones that make sure that the sound cues go up, that the lighting cues change, that the backdrops change. And if they didn't do that, then the performance wouldn't be as good. Of course, in a presentation or a formal performance, right? So what we're gonna do is make sure that we are choreographing those backstage elements, those tech elements, just as much as we're choreographing whatever's happening in your scene, right? So it's not uncommon to see OM teams planning to move their backdrops deliberately, or everyone on the team knowing what his or her role is, even when they're not on stage, right? They have something that they need to be doing in order to make sure that the solution is presented as effectively as possible, right? So you can ask yourself, where are people when they're not performing, right? Or should they be poking their head out around the side? Should the audience see them standing off to the side if they're not in the scene? Should they be hiding behind something so it's not as distracting? So just think through those other components that aren't a part of the performance at that moment, but they are a part of the solution, right? Because if you need to be having cast members backstage or team members backstage doing something, some technical component, then they need to be doing that, right? That choreography is just as important as any sort of movement that's part of the performance of your solution. So keep that in mind. All right, when it comes to this notion of pacing and speed running, so 8 minutes is not a lot of time. I've said this ad nauseum at this point, but 8 minutes is not going to give you all the time you want to convey all the ideas that you want. But what happens is some teams try to fit in as much as possible. They try to take a 30-minute presentation and condense it into 8 minutes. So what happens is, as soon as they begin the scene, they start talking like this, they start talking very fast, and they keep going, and they say, oh, here's our set, here's our thing, here's our artwork, and they just talk so fast, and there's no pause and there's no break. Why? Because that team is trying to fit too much into 8 minutes when really what they have is content for a 30-minute presentation, right? So this takes us back to our conversation on getting rid of the excess, right? Editing, cutting the fluff from the presentation, and leaving just what's necessary to make sure we fully efficiently use those 8 minutes without putting too much extra stuff in there, right? So the big problem here is that your audience and judges are seeing this solution for the first time. So even if you know, as a team, you know what you're saying because you performed this a million times. So even if you speak so quickly, like all of you, your team members, you know, because this is your skit, you wrote it. But the judges and the audience will have no idea what you're saying. They'll have no idea what your story is about. They won't even get the gist of what you're trying to put out there because it's moving too fast. There's too much. And keep in mind, they're scoring different components of your long-term solution while you're presenting your presentation. So if it's not well thought through and easily planned and smartly timed, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to understand what you're trying to convey in your solution. So if you have to race through to make it under the 8 minutes, you probably have too much information, and you should really revisit that whole idea of cutting and editing the fluff. The other thing is that in conversations, quiet moments and deliberate pauses are expected, right? So sometimes we can pause for dramatic effect. I just pause for dramatic effect, right? To emphasize a particular point. That happens in conversation, and it can happen in your presentations, and should, right? Your presentations are essentially a way of communicating, and when we communicate, we have dramatic pauses on purpose, right? So if you have a scene where you're just racing through so much and you don't have time just to let the audience and the judges breathe, or your actors breathe for that matter, your team members breathe, it's going to feel very unnatural. It's going to feel very forced and very rushed. So again, just think about the pacing of your performance. If you're speed running through everything, chances are you have a little too much, and maybe you would benefit from some editing. Now, I will say the last note here is that high energy is good. We're not saying like, have a slow scene that's super boring and super slow. That's not what we're talking about. But if you want to have high energy is highlighted actually if you have some of those down moments, right? If you have a character that talks pretty regularly, right? Just having a conversation. But then you have a character come in that talks like this and is very excited and is super pumped about everything. Suddenly that character, the energetic character, is highlighted because there's a contrast between that character type and the one that was talking at a natural rate, right? So just keep that in mind as you're going through it, and make sure that you're clear in your presentation of your solution. All right. One thing I've alluded to throughout is This is the millionth time that you and your team have performed, maybe not the literal millionth time, but you've performed your solution many, many times because you've been practicing, but it's your audience's first time seeing. Your audience includes judges, right? So if we think back to the curse of knowledge, which if you can recall from a previous lesson, is the idea that you know things pretty well. You know your solution better than anyone because you've lived with it for several weeks and months, right? You practiced it for several weeks and for several months. But your audience and your judges are not as familiar with your solution as you are, and you can't assume that they are, because if you assume that they are, then you're not going to communicate your solution as well as you should be. So don't take for granted what the audience and the judges know, or what they're going to understand, or what they're going to see, or what they're going to hear, because they are seeing this for the very first time. That's why in your 8 minutes, what you want to do is highlight your solution, highlight those key elements that are required by the problem, and don't fill it with a bunch of fluff or things that aren't getting scored, because if you do, it's going to confuse your audience, it's going to confuse your judges, and it's going to cost you points, because if they don't understand something, they're just not going to give you points for it, right? The goal here of your solution, of your performance, is to communicate your solution effectively to the judges. I want to repeat that. The goal of your performance is to communicate your solution effectively to the judges. That's what you want to do. So everything in service of that, wonderful. Anything that detracts or takes away from that, get rid of it. It's not necessary, and it's only going to cost you points in the end. All right, last thing here is getting feedback from reactions. Now, we talked about outside assistance in an earlier lesson, and I told you that you're not allowed to get any help from outside sources, right? So you can't ask mom and dad or teachers or anybody else to do anything for you. And similarly, you can't sit them down and say, hey, mom and dad, I want you to watch this performance and then tell us what you think is good and what you think is not good. Tell us what you think we should do differently. Now, that's asking for ideas from an outside source, and therefore it's outside assistance. So that's not okay. But what is okay is it's fine to perform your solution in front of your parents, in front of family and friends, in front of your teachers, and just see how they react, right? That's totally fine. Did they laugh after you made a joke in your skit that you wrote deliberately to be a joke? Did they seem confused or unclear about what was happening at any point in time? Afterwards, when you were done, they say, oh, I love that costume, how beautiful, like that's wonderful. Great, right? That's fine. They can say that they liked something. They can't do it deliberately to point it out to you, right? But if they like the performance, they can say that they liked your performance. It's a normal, acceptable way to give feedback in that capacity from parents, teachers, friends, whatever. That is totally acceptable. But what you can't do is ask for feedback explicitly. You can't say, oh, tell us the parts you loved and the parts you hated. No, like if they watch it and laugh and then they tell you that they loved a costume when it was done, that's on them, right? That's fine. So you're observing the feedback, right? If they laugh when they're supposed to laugh, if they seem like they get it, or they, are really enjoying themselves when they stand up at the end and they say, like, they give you a round of applause, you can take that as, oh, okay, well, maybe something is clearly working. If you're performing your solution and you look in the audience and people have very confused looks on their faces, so they're like talking to each other, they don't quite know what's going on, maybe that's an implicit cue or feedback to you that something is unclear and you might need to maybe make it a little clearer, right? So that is fine in the sense that you're not asking for outside assistance. You're not telling somebody that you need feedback. You're not telling somebody you want feedback. You're not asking for it in any way, but you can watch, and if they laugh, if they look confused, whatever, that's totally fine. We use this all the time in the comedy world. When we write comedy scenes, we test them out in front of test audiences. We don't ask them for feedback. We're not going to the audience asking them to fill out a survey. All we do is we perform. If they laugh at the jokes we hope they laugh at, we know it worked. And if they don't laugh at the jokes that we hope they laugh at, well, we need to replace those jokes with something that they will laugh at, right? So be thinking about the feedback in that way. It keeps you safe from outside assistance because, again, you're not explicitly asking for feedback. You're not telling people you need it. You're not taking ideas from people, specific ideas for your solution, but their response in terms of laughter, confusion, things like that, you can watch that, engage, and then you go back as a team and determine if you want to tweak your solution accordingly, and that is okay. All right, so that brings us to our progress report for this lesson. Question 1, do you know the importance of maximizing your 8 minutes, using those 8 minutes wisely, using that limited time wisely? Number 2, do you know the value of choreographing your solution? So making sure that your characters all have deliberate movements, but not just your characters, but also your team members that are backstage, that are off stage, if they're supposed to be doing something like the balsa wood testing or the vehicle riding, whatever the case may be. Do they have those movements planned out, right? Or is every part of your 8 minutes choreographed? And then question 3, do you know how to get feedback from reactions, right? So not teetering into the world of outside assistance where you're asking somebody to tell you what to do or what part needs changed, but watching their response, hearing what they said that they enjoyed about your presentation, and then knowing how to make changes based on if they laughed at your jokes or if they looked confused during your 8-minute solution, all right? Now, our big checklist, we're moving on. We have just completed practice, 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 which means our next lesson is going to be all about paperwork. So I will see you then.